So I was having a discussion with somebody a couple months ago. It's interesting as you reflect over the last couple years. One of the things we seem to be in this season of lawlessness, and you could pick a topic and you could point to where some stuff is going on, and where are the laws? Why aren't they being enforced? It's just crazy things, and I don't want to get into names and things, but it's just crazy. And somebody said, we haven't had that in a long, long time. I know this particular person was talking about in the early 70s, late 60s. You had a period of time where there was a lot of lawlessness, and then we seemed to kind of go away, but now it's really picked up over the last couple years. And as you think about end times, is lawlessness going to get better or worse? Worse. And so that's crazy to think about, that what we're seeing and experiencing as you look around the United States and just all the craziness and corruption and just different things, it's just like, wow. And so today we're going to look at God's law, and he kind of qualifies some things. A lot of different topics we're going to go through today, but just to kind of frame the conversation today. Remember last week Adam talked about that God's law was kind of a contrast to the rest of the world that they lived in, that the laws that God had given, there was some contrast. There was different. Today we'll look at some laws, and you'll be able to see God's character through these laws. These people said that they had faith in God. One of the ways they just demonstrated that was through their worship, but what was another way that they demonstrated their faith? Obeying his word, through obedience. And, a lot of people kind of read through these type of chapters, and they're kind of like, well, it's really not for me, and how does that fit with me? But remember, it gives us context. So later on, as you're reading through the Word of God, then things will begin to start to click about why they did this or why they did that. And so it gives a deeper meaning to the story. And as we go through the discussion today, we'll point out some New Testament examples that kind of play into this. So let's begin. Exodus 22. We're going to try and get through the whole chapter. Lots of topics to talk about. This first thing has to deal with property and thieves, and so what does that mean? We'll read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 22. It says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 ox for the one ox, and 4 sheep for the one sheep. If a thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltness on his account. But if the sun has risen on him, there will be blood guiltness on his account. He shall surely make restitution. If he owes nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If what he stole is actually found alive and in his possession, whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. And the verse 1 introduces the ideal of restitution. There, can you think of an example in the New Testament where you hear about restitution? In a story of a man and a tree.
Jesus giving restitution for all our sins.
Yeah, Jesus giving restitution for our sins. Do you remember the tax collector? Story of the tax collector, and what did he do? Paid restitution. So as we talk about understanding the context of things, going through this kind of helps us understand as we read other passages in the Word of God. Verse 2 and 3, some translations have it differently, but it's a thief versus the night and versus the day. And if a thief is killed at night, that's okay to do. You know, that's okay to do because it's at night. You're startled. You can't necessarily see. You don't know if he's armed. You just have this intruder coming in. In the day, it's the total opposite. And why would it be the total opposite in the day? Be what? You could see who it is. You could tell if they have a weapon. And it might be interpreted as what? Revenge. It might be interpreted as revenge. And so that's the difference there. And that's why if you did it during the day, if it happened during the day, you would have blood on your hands. And that's why it's worded that way.
Kill them during the day and hide them till night.
Yeah. Some commentaries, and I don't know how true this is, typically were people in their house during the day? Not really. Not really. And so, yeah, so that's another thing. They don't have TV. So, yeah. They're outside. Yeah. Yeah, no air conditioning in the house. Yeah, it got really hot. Verse 4 talks about the idea if a thief stole something and it was found. So what's the criteria for that? It says if the possession is found or the animal is found, he's to pay a double in restitution. So let's go on to verse 5. Verse 5. Let's read down through 6. If a man lets a field or a vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animals loose so that it grazes in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes, so that stacked grain or the standing grain of the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall surely make restitution. And so this is, verse 5 speaks of an animal wandering. People typically didn't have fences for their livestock, and typically with their neighbors, they just had an agreement. But this here is dealing with the idea that the animal has eaten considerably and eaten into the profits, and so you're to repay that either in grain or in your vineyards. Verse 6 talks about the person who starts a fire, and it doesn't say if it's an accidental fire, the person gets a pass. It just says if whoever started a fire, there's restitution to be involved. And I was thinking back when we lived at the lake, we had some property across the street that we dumped all of our leaves and stuff on, just an empty lot, and so I had this discussion with my wife. I said, I wonder if we should kind of clean some of that up, maybe burn some of this stuff. And she said, no, let's not worry about it. And so I had a bonfire on our other property. And 4 or 5 days later, I'm cleaning up the ashes and I dump them over on that empty lot. Oh, man. Not a good idea. Even 4 or 5 days later, I thought, oh, I'll be fine. No. Lot caught on fire. There were a couple dead ashes. They were, oh man! Thankfully, the hose reached across the road, and and my wife came to bail me out, But yeah, get away from you quick. I mean, and you're on the hook. No, we were out in the country. We were out in the country, and yeah, that's back. Yeah, and that's place where you could still burn leaves where you can't. Right. Yeah. Oh, get rid of it. Let's go down to verse 7. It says, as if a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is of ox or donkey or sheep, for clothing or any lost thing, above which one says, this is it, the case of both parties shall come together before the judge. He whom the judge condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. And so this is an item that's stolen, and it's something that was in your possession, belonged to somebody else, was stolen, and so you have a sense of responsibility. That's one of the things that we're losing in our culture, it seems, is that there's no responsibility. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy to think about. And a judge, and this is one of the matters that a judge would decide. And if the judge thought you were guilty, then you would pay double. Again, this whole idea of restitution, you would pay double to your neighbor. A lot of these things are like, as we go through this chapter and beyond in the next couple chapters, it really helps the community survive and live together. And that's why these things are in place. When you take these things away, it's just going to become this free-for-all, this chaos, and we see it today played out. Let's go down to verse number 10. It says, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey or an ox or sheep or any animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by two of them that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property, and its owner shall accept it, and he shall make restitution, shall not make restitution. But if it is actually stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is all torn to pieces, let him bring it as evidence, and he shall not make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is with it, he shall make full restitution, or the owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. Verse 15 says, if the owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is a hired, as it came for hire. So here we're looking at borrowing an animal for maybe working a field or whatever. And so what happens if this animal wanders away? Who does the responsibility fall to? And those, and he could say, well, he stole it, and the reality is it wandered away. The way to get out of that was to take an oath before the Lord, and that was something you could do, and that was a pretty serious thing to make an oath to the Lord, and you wouldn't have to pay restitution. Now, if it was in your care and it was stolen, you would have to make restitution. If it dies, if it's injured while you're using it, you would have to make restitution. And this is kind of where we kind of get some of our thinking, if we borrow something from somebody and it breaks, we take care of it, we fix it, verse 15 talks about if the owner's present while you're using that ox to plow a field or whatever and it's injured or died, then you're not on the hook for restitution. All right. So those are some laws as it relates to property, and what are the consequences, what are the responsibilities, who's responsible, who's not responsible, and so that's what these first 15 verses kind of lay out for them, and it's just interesting how years later some of that has seeped into our culture and our laws and our way of life today. Now we're going to switch gears totally in a different direction. In verse 16, let's read 16 and 17. It says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. And so this is talking about two people. This is not about rape. That's dealt with differently. This is not talking about adultery. Totally different. These two verses are a reference to people say consensual sex. And so what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that, premarital sex was something that was highly regarded. Today we kind of dismiss it, that it's not a big deal, but in this culture, in that day, part of the reason is who would pick the wife, or who would pick the husband for the bride? The father. It was prearranged marriages, and so that's why it says in here that if you do this, then you have to pay a dowry. And the other option could be that you have to pay and you not get the wife. You know what I'm saying? That was an option. And why would you have to pay a dowry? She's no longer a virgin, and her value is diminished, greatly diminished. Totally different than our culture. You know what I'm saying? Way different than our culture. But yeah, the protection, God's trying to protect who in this? The woman. Protect the woman, yeah.
But don't you wonder, how come the man's not, he can have sex anytime he wanted to. And that was no big deal.
No, there were consequences.
Were there?
Yeah.
I didn't read it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's other laws about adultery and other things. And it's interesting too. Here as we go through this here at Exodus, we're addressing behaviors. But then when you read through the Gospels, what does Jesus do? He doesn't just address the behavior, addressing the heart and the thought. He takes it a step further. And so I just wanted to point that out. No. So, right, we're not, in these verses, we're not talking about rape. Rape's a whole nother discussion.
She didn't want to be bothered, and it would have to be a force or something.
It
Made her agree to it, I guess. think she wanted to because it said he seduces her. So,
He seduces her.
so she was in agreement.
Yeah,
It wasn't her idea.
right.
Whatever it is.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah. Totally different culture than, I mean, today. Right, right. Yeah. Let's go on to verse 18. Now, these next couple of verses, these next couple of verses deal with other gods and bringing them in, Verse 18. Let's read 18 through 20. You shall not allow a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. He who sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be utterly destroyed. And again, this kind of plays into that. Some people have that polytheism idea, and they allow these other things to come in, and these things, all three of these things had the same kind of punishment, which was death. I mean, it was black and white.
In 18, who makes a decision if someone is a sorceress or not? Where does that come from?
It doesn't say. It doesn't say. But think about sorcery. These people are not that far removed from Egypt. As you think about the first couple plagues back in Egypt, what did the sorcerers do? They mimicked. They could mimic these plagues. And so,
The sorcerers in Egypt were males. This talks about females.
yeah, it was interesting, that they made them.
Who accuses a woman of being a sorceress and gets killed in the process? Who has that responsibility or authority?
Yeah, it's. I mean, if she has a husband, I mean it falls to him. It falls to the people in that community that she's to be put to death. And it was interesting in kind of studying this because in our minds we think about magic. You know what I'm saying? And so what about magic for entertainment purposes? Does this kind of fall into what you read about here? And I got two different views on it. You know what I'm saying? One said that magic for entertainment was allowable, but then I read another commentary, and they said, no, it's not. As you read in the Torah, it's not allowed at all. No type of divination or any of that. And again, this idea of sorcery, they're putting themselves in the place of who? In place of God, and so.
It also could be specific to a sorceress because of who they were going to be coming in contact with.
Yeah.
Could have been more dominant women.
Right.
Were doing the sorcery as opposed to in Egypt.
Right. And what's the example about that in a few books over?
When that woman was going around talking about Jesus, she was.
Well, let's stick to the Old Testament. Dick will remember this well. Drawing a blank. Who was that? Yeah, the Witch of Endor. Yeah. Yeah. So. Too funny. Verse 19. Again, this is something that was involved in pagan worship.
Yeah, listen, I'm at Bible study.
And So verse 19 deals with, again, pagan worship. And these things just kind of, if we're not careful, it creeps into our culture. And we begin to accept things. Verse 20 talks about sacrifices to other gods other than the Lord. In the land where they lived, were there a lot of other religions? There was. And so the penalty for that was death. I appreciate Sunday. It was good to hear. I don't know if those that were here on Sunday got to hear Phil Martin. And again, this God seems so harsh in the Old Testament. And I appreciate Phil kind of reconciling that with the New Testament. You know what I'm saying? And how all that fits together. And we sometimes, I don't know why we do that, but we feel in the New Testament that God is not as harsh. And I appreciate Phil addressing that on Sunday. That was good to see. Let's go over to verse 21. We'll read down through 27. It says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry. And my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets, for that is the only covering in his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious." And as I was reading through this, so these people have been oppressed. And so what's their natural tendency to be as they treat other people? Oppressors. Confession time. Who had strict parents? And were you strict as a parent? What was your tendency? Yeah. And so yeah, I find myself yelling at my kids or something, and I'm like, thinking about how I was raised, and I didn't have Christian parents when I was younger, but yeah, you just kind of fall into those tendencies of kind of repeating some of those things, and if you're not careful, people get oppressed, and as you read in these verses, what does it say about God's character as you read down through about these widows and these orphans? He protects them. He protects them, yeah. God says he will hear their cry. And again, what is the penalty? Death. God said, I will destroy you. And this is how you treat people. It's,
Read this verse ties into 1 Timothy chapter 5.
1 Timothy chapter 5.
Ties right into this.
Which says,
Widows, children.
oh, yeah, good point. Appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, you see this again repeated throughout Scripture, right? That God is going to protect them. He's going to hear them. As you think about doing business among fellow believers, they weren't to charge interest. And if somebody gave you their coat as collateral, you were to give it back, as was custom in that day. But God said, no, you're not to charge interest. It's not a business venture. And so God says he'll destroy you. It was interesting, one of the commentaries I was reading, we think back during the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln talks about how the Civil War, in referencing the Civil War, how that was God's judgment. And the commentator, rightfully so, I mean, the whole thing was about slavery. And what happened in slavery back in those days with widows and orphans and how they were treated. And Abraham Lincoln addressed that in one of his speeches. And so verse 28, and again, this could be a message all in itself. It says, you shall not curse God nor curse a ruler of your people. And so those that are in authority, and again, you see this all through Scripture, who sets up the authority? God. God puts those things in place, and I've been reading through a book on 3 kings and talking about Saul, David, and Absalom, and kind of from David's perspective. And it's just interesting, thinking through David and how did he respond to Saul as Saul was throwing a spear at him? You know what I'm saying? What was David's reaction? And in that relationship that went on for years, how did David respond? He refused to. And we live in a crazy time. You know what I'm saying? And is God unaware? God's not unaware. Who's running Russia? Is he unaware? I mean, he's not. And having studied some of Revelation in different passages, it's kind of cool to kind of see some things come together. Whatever, we don't know if it's the end times or whatever, but
it does seem like since the Holy Spirit, the day of Pentecost, the devils had more free reign.
yeah,
And it's more up to us
right.
to play God, I guess you could say.
Well, not to play God, but
Well, the Holy Spirit
right.
working through us
Yeah,
to deal with it.
yeah,
Because Jesus said, greater works will we do.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's why the devil has more free reign.
Yeah, and we don't, and I'm guilty of it too. We don't pray for our leaders like we're told to in the New Testament. We don't, we may not like who's in the White House, but God's not unaware. You know what I'm saying? And it's all for His honor and His glory. It's just interesting to look at. Some have kicked around the idea because, you read about the 10, I think it's the 10 nations. Jim, you correct me if I'm wrong. But as you read about in the end times, there's the 10 nations. And when NATO kind of started, people thought, oh, this is kind of playing into that. And but now it's ballooned to, I don't forget how many countries are part of NATO now. And so now there's this, because it talks about the Roman Empire being revived. and this number 10, and so it's just interesting to see, maybe this is a play that'll break up NATO. You know what I'm saying? And people will realize that NATO is not that strong. It's interesting to kind of think through, but what it is. I was reminded too. Paul was brought before the council, and he was spreading the gospel, preaching the gospel. Wasn't supposed to be preaching the gospel, and Paul was giving a response to a ruler, but he realized that he was out of line. And I didn't write this passage down. I should have wrote this down. But what did Paul do when he realized who he was speaking to? He apologized. He apologized. And again, it plays into this idea, that God has set these people in place. God has set this order in place, and you respect the office. You respect the office. Right. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like it. We have to pray for them. Right. Yeah. Yeah. We can't say that. Oh. Yeah.
Okay, right now, most of us don't care much for the super weak president we've got.
Right.
You look at scripture, when Gog is ready to come down and take over Israel,
Right.
to prepare for the Lord to come in and wipe them out,
Yeah.
Israel has to, at that time, be in a condition where no one will stand with them.
Yeah.
America is no longer an ally of Israel.
Right.
The people in NATO are no longer going to be an ally of Israel. So when God wants to come down and wipe out Israel, so God can come and wipe out Gog,
Right. Right.
those things are being set up right now.
The Battle of Armageddon. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, our support has to disappear. It did.
Right.
We were the ones most supporting Israel, and now we will not do a thing for them.
Yeah.
Read the scriptures.
Yeah. 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 Great point. Jim was talking about NATO and the United States supporting Israel, and all that has to go away as you look towards the Battle of Armageddon, and right. That's where we are today, and
When I think about that verse 28, I think of Job chapter 2, verse 9. And the only thing that Job's wife is quoted in saying is, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die.
Good wifely advice.
yeah.
The only thing she's known to say in the Bible. How would you like to have that?
Yeah.
And you notice, when everything shakes out, Job loses everything he's got, except for his wife.
Yeah. Job.
You don't want to tell him to curse God and
Yeah.
die.
Still there.
Yeah. Brian read a verse out of Job and talking about what the only response that's recorded from Job's wife, and she tells him to curse God.
That reminds me of a story my wife told me. She says, Brian, I spent all these years raising the kids. You know, we still have a son at home, but let's say Tom eventually moves out.
Yeah.
And I'm still left with you, raising you in the house.
Yeah. My wife says the same thing. People ask my wife how many kids she has, and so it varies from day to day. And so it's interesting to talk about end times and to just kind of see how things in the modern thing kind of play into that. But again, we don't know, and so. Yeah, it's hard to watch the suffering of those people, and
But we will all be surprised
Yeah.
Everybody has their own idea, but we're all gonna be surprised, because God says we do not know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we don't know.
No,
Right.
we can kind of guess or kind of see, like you say, the things that are turning over now, but that doesn't mean that's still God's plan. We know His plan is for good.
Right, right, right. And in Russia, it's interesting. Years ago, some of you were here. There was a pastor came and shared how he believes that America's Babylon, and he kind of laid out his case for that. And if you read about that, America's destroyed. You know what I'm saying? And it's interesting too, as you think about a third of the earth burning up, North and South America and Central America is about the equivalent of a third of the earth being burned up. And so it's interesting to look at these things, and so thankfully the Lord is in control, even in the midst of all this chaos and suffering. The Lord is in control. And let's go to verse 29. Verse 29 says, "You shall not delay the offering from your harvest and of your vintage. The firstborn of your sons to you shall be given to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me." Flip back over to Exodus 13. Because as you read here in these verses, it says, the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. What does that mean? Do we offer them in a sacrifice to the Lord? Go back over to chapter 13 of Exodus. Let's start reading in verse 1. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both man and beast, belong to me." And Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt and from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord has brought you out from that place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten." And again, it's this idea of giving your children, your firstborn, over to the Lord, giving them to the Lord. And the same, now with animals, you would sacrifice them, the firstborn. And there were requirements. And as you read through verse 30, it tells you how many days to wait. Does anybody have any ideas why you would wait 8 days?
At the time of human males is when they circumcise them.
It's when they circumcise them. And with animals, I forget all the biology there, but are they in a healthy place? Not until the 8th day. There's a little bit of biology in there, which I read about. I can't recall all the details. No. And right, and again too, you wanted something perfect. Later on you'll read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy how it had to be perfect. All right, last verse. We've covered a lot of different topics today, and here's another one. It says, you shall be holy men to me, therefore. You shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So what is he talking about here? meat mangled in the field. And was that a free meal? No. You don't eat roadkill. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, yeah. Yeah, down south there might be a different thing, but you don't eat roadkill. And again, that goes, as you get into the Levitical law and the draining of the blood and all of that, it's unclean. And so there was no such thing as a free lunch. You know what I'm saying? And so now thinking about that, as you think over a few books in the Bible, you read about a guy by the name of Samson. And does anybody know where Samson got the honey? From the dead lion. From the dead lion. Was that?
He's the one that killed the lion, and then
Right.
later on, the bees went in and put a hive inside the dead lion's carcass.
Right. Some days had gone by, and he'd come back by that way and saw this honey and partook of it. And so that's what I'm talking about. Is as we go through these laws, later on, as you read about Samson, and you kind of get a deeper understanding, a better context of where he's living. And not only does he enjoy it, but what does he do? He passes it on to his parents. Does he tell him? No, he doesn't tell him. And so, and again, the beginning of the verse, what's God's desire for us? To be holy, to be clean, to be clean before Him. And so, and that's the purpose of all these rules and regulations. Some of us kind of fall in that category, tend to be a rebel, and we don't like rules and stuff, but they're there to protect us. They're there to help us, and we see the character of God in how He protects His people, and so.